For most of human history, the fastest piece of information on Earth traveled at the speed of a horse. A battle was won or lost, a king died, a ship sank in a storm, and the world beyond the horizon would not know for days, sometimes weeks, sometimes longer. The delay was not a flaw anyone was trying to fix. It was simply the nature of reality. Distance and time were the same thing. That assumption collapsed in the 1830s, not with a bang, but with a pulse of electricity moving down a wire. To understand why the telegraph mattered so much, you have to sit inside the world it replaced. A merchant in Philadelphia, waiting for commodity prices from New Orleans. A newspaper editor in Boston, trying to report on a congressional vote taken in Washington 3 days ago. A railroad dispatcher, trying to coordinate 2 trains on a single track, separated by 40 miles of countryside, and no way to speak to either one. In each case, the information existed somewhere. The problem was that carrying it required a physical object, a letter, a rider, a printed page. And physical objects moved at the pace of roads, rivers, and weather. The constraint was not a lack of ambition. It was a fundamental physics problem. Before electromagnetism was understood and applied, there was no way to separate information from matter. The two were locked together. If you wanted to send a fact somewhere, you had to send something physical that contained that fact, and that object had to travel the full distance on its own. The theoretical possibility of electrical signaling over a wire had existed since the early 19th century. Several inventors in Europe and America were working on versions of it through the 1830s. The story of the telegraph is not a lone genius story. It is a story about a problem that was clearly defined enough that multiple people converged on a similar answer at nearly the same time. Samuel Morse in the United States was among the most consequential of those people, not necessarily because his underlying insight was uniquely original, but because the system he helped develop, the code, the hardware, and the political backing, was the one that achieved practical deployment at scale in America. The first American telegraph line of real consequence connected Washington and Baltimore in 1844. The distance was roughly 40 miles. A message that would have taken a courier several hours now arrived in minutes. The demonstration was public and deliberate. The results of a Whig Party nominating convention in Baltimore were transmitted to Washington before the train carrying the official paper announcement had completed the same journey. Information had outrun its physical carrier for the first time in a way ordinary people could witness and verify. But a single line between 2 cities was a demonstration, not a system. The real transformation came from expansion and standardization. Through the late 1840s and into the 1850s, telegraph lines spread across the eastern United States with remarkable speed. Following railroad rights-of-way, because the railroads had already solved the land access problem, and because the 2 technologies had an immediate operational dependency on each other. Railroads needed real-time communication to run safely. A telegraph line along the tracks made dispatching possible. The relationship was mutually reinforcing. The railroads built the corridors, and the telegraph made the railroads safer and more profitable. By the time the 1850s were underway, the telegraph had done something that no previous communications technology had managed. It had made markets simultaneous. A commodity price in Chicago could reach New York in the time it took to tap out the message. Before that, traders in different cities were operating on information that was hours or days out of date, which meant that price differences between cities were often a measure of how old your information was rather than a true reflection of supply and demand. The telegraph began to collapse those gaps. Financial and commodity markets consolidated because they had to. The information advantage that came from being in a different city had shrunk dramatically. Political news moved the same way. Newspaper editors who had previously relied on mail coaches and express riders now had access to dispatches arriving almost in real time. Wire services emerged as a direct consequence. The Associated Press was founded in 1846, just 2 years after the Washington-Baltimore line opened, specifically because a group of New York newspapers recognized that sharing the cost of telegraphed news reports was more efficient than each paper independently paying for the same dispatches. The AP did not cause the telegraph, but the telegraph made the AP's existence logical and inevitable. The structure of journalism, who gathered information, how it was priced, and how quickly it reached readers, was reorganized around the new constraint that the wire had imposed. The mechanism itself deserves a moment. The telegraph did not transmit voice. It transmitted on-off pulses of electrical current down a wire, and those pulses were interpreted by a trained operator who listened to or read a pattern of short and long signals, what became known as Morse code, and converted them back into letters and words. The system required a human being at each end who knew the code. That dependency created an entire skilled profession, the telegraph operator, that had not existed before and would eventually stop existing after the telephone, and later systems made it obsolete. For roughly half a century, those operators were the people who actually moved information across the country. There was a cost embedded in this system that is easy to overlook. The telegraph made information faster, but it also made information more expensive for the people sending it, more filtered and more dependent on an intermediary. A letter was private. A telegram passed through at least one operator at each end. The compression that the system encouraged, brevity was economical because messages were priced by the word, changed how people communicated. Emotional nuance was expensive. Clarity was cheap. The style of the telegram, clipped and direct, became a template for a certain kind of official or urgent communication that outlasted the medium itself. And the technology was not equally available. Access to the telegraph network was concentrated in cities and along rail lines. Rural communities, especially in the years before the network fully matured, remained in something closer to the old world, waiting days for news that cities already knew. The telegraph made the information gap between urban and rural life measurable in a new way, because for the first time there was a baseline of real time that rural communities clearly could not reach. The relative importance of the telegraph declined as the telephone spread in the early 20th century. Voice communication eliminated the need for the operator intermediary and required no training in code. The long-distance telephone call eventually offered what the telegraph had promised, but with a naturalness the telegram never had. By the time the mid-20th century arrived, the telegram had become a specialist instrument, associated primarily with formal announcements, urgent official business, and the grim task of delivering news too important to wait for the post. But the legacy of the telegraph is not in the hardware that eventually became obsolete. It is in the expectations it created and the systems it forced into existence. Markets that learned to price on current information rather than week-old reports could not revert. News organizations built around the wire could not unbuild themselves. Railroads that learned to dispatch trains by telegraph became structurally dependent on real-time signaling. The expectation that information should move faster than the people carrying it, that there is something wrong, something correctable, about a delay, that expectation did not exist before the telegraph. The telegraph did not satisfy a demand that was already there. It created a demand by demonstrating that the old delay was not natural law. It was just physics, and physics could be worked around. The first time news moved faster than a horse most people probably did not fully register what had changed. They received the information, acted on it, and moved on. What they could not see was that the category of questions they were allowed to ask had permanently expanded. From that point forward, every future delay in communication would be experienced not as the natural order of things, but as a solvable problem. That shift in expectation, quiet, invisible, and total, may be the most consequential thing the telegraph ever transmitted. Visual reconstructions are illustrative. Facts and interpretations are based on the sources listed in the description.